Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to a Holyrood Sources podcast special. Happy New Year to Jeff Aberdeen, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Jeff.
Happy New Year, Callum, and to our listeners.
And to our listeners indeed. And Happy New Year to Andy McKeever, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello, Happy New Year. You're the one who says we're not supposed to date stamp these podcasts. Remember the lectures we get, Jeff, about not, we've got to be able to live forever.
But it's New Year. It's New Year, I get to say.
Okay, fair enough.
New Year, same us. I'm Callum MacDonald. Hello. You join us to partake, to listen, to watch, to be a part of an exclusive conversation today. We are recording on Tuesday the 7th of January. Today you are going to hear from both the First Minister of Scotland, John Swinney, and the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Kate Forbes. We're really thrilled to be recording at the newly opened Resident Hotel in Edinburgh, who have been so brilliantly supportive of our podcast efforts since we launched. We are just a 4-minute walk from Princes Street. We are just round the corner from Bute House, in fact, the official residence of the First Minister. And we're recording this opening part, before our guests arrive in the next little while. We're just so thrilled to be here. Great hospitality at the Resident. You should all book a room and you should all do it right now. With just 15 months to go then until the next Holyrood election, this year could prove to be one of the most politically consequential years in the history of the Scottish Parliament. And Jeff, we are having a unique conversation today. We're going to have the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister together, a dynamic that perhaps we're not all that used to seeing. It's quite a significant day. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I'm looking forward to it, particularly if we can get them to contradict each other, you know. It's amazing really when you think about the recent past for the SNP. Following the election result, losing so many MPs, they were a bit of a nadir. And now, if polling's to be believed and the budget process that we've just gone through is to be believed that'll be passed, then they're in a bit of a decent position. I wouldn't say any more than a decent position. I think there's a lot of water flow under the bridge before we say that they're strong favourites for 2026. But nonetheless, it's been quite a turnaround, and it'll be interesting to tease out of John Swinney and Kate Forbes how they can build on that momentum that they've established.
Crucially on that, Andy, this has always been referred to as the Swinney-Forbes administration, the partnership, and we're about to see and hear from them both. It's quite remarkable, actually, that to think of an administration in the terms of the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in partnership. That doesn't feel that common to me.
No, I don't think it is common at all. I think it was a necessity of what happened a year ago in John Swinney's attempts to take over the party and then unify it. But it's pretty remarkable what we're about to have them together in the room. I think you said it's rare. I don't think our broadcast colleagues will correct us if I'm wrong. I don't think they've ever been interviewed together before, actually. But think about, a couple of years ago, we had Kate Forbes and Humza Yousaf in a leadership contest which pretty much ripped the SNP wide open, and where John Swinney, of course, was pretty critical of Kate Forbes at that time and was supporting Humza Yousaf. Less than 2 years later, here the pair of them are running the country, and not only running the country, but at the moment doing significantly better in pretty much every poll than anybody would possibly have expected them to do this time last year when they took over. So, 2 years, an awful lot has changed in 2 years, and it's a really great opportunity to see them together, see the interplay, and crucially find out what they've got planned.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of which, shall we talk briefly about the budget process? Because today, on the day of recording, less than a week into the new year, and it looks like the First Minister has got his budget over the finish line, Jeff. This is because the Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar, said today that his party is going to abstain from the budget vote at Holyrood. What's your take on that?
Well, he's played good politics. I don't want to be clever after the event, but I have said on this podcast on several occasions recently that minority government can be to your advantage if you play the politics well. And I think, to be fair to John Swinney, he's played the politics well. He has been aided and abetted by a UK government at Westminster who's opened the door on certain issues that we've covered, and I'm sure we'll cover in our discussion. So that's no doubt helped them. But yes, he looks certain he's going to get his budget passed. He will be very pleased about that. What I'm more interested in is what's next. And what's next? How does he build on that? going forward? How does he turn that into an election victory in 15 months' time?
Yeah. You were actually at the First Minister's speech in Edinburgh yesterday, Andy. Anna Sarwar also made a speech yesterday. These big set-piece things to set off the new year, and then those who are sensible come on this podcast to follow up and to do a bit more in-depth conversation as well. What did you make of the First Minister, his tone, his approach, his speech? What's happened since?
And asked to invite me, so I went to John's. I went to John's instead. It was, I mean, it was obviously
I was
very...
invited to both, and I went to neither.
It was. Look, it wasn't. They were traditional New Year speeches. You know, they weren't massively policy heavy. They had political messages rather than policy messages in them. To be honest with you, but you know, they both in the. I mean, I watched Anas's speech after. They were both perfectly competent speeches. There wasn't a lot in either speech that you could necessarily disagree with. But I think that what it probably hit home, and we'll get into this when we speak to them in a moment. The budget was / is, we can almost say was now that we know it's going to be passed. It was a competent budget. But let's face it, the bar over the last few years has been pretty low. Okay? We have not been governed all that well over the last few years. It was a competent budget. It reset things. It does provide the foundation for an improvement in some key areas. But it wasn't any more than competent, right? And I think one thing that we have to remember, and that they have to remember as well, I'm sure this is in their minds, but whilst they're riding high in the polls and while everything's going well, nothing's actually changed out in the real world as a result of their 9 or so months in charge. You know, there's a lot of water still to flow under the bridge here. There are still queues at A&E. You know, the kids are still struggling in schools. Taxes are still as high as they were. There are still as many potholes in roads as there were before. Nothing has actually changed in terms of people's real world expectations and in terms of the real world experiences. And that is important, because when it comes to an election, it's going to be about delivery, and they've got to show in the sort of next part of their time in charge that they can actually make a difference out there in the real world as well as inside the political bubble.
Which is why it's so important they don't rest on their laurels.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, listen, if I'm Anna Sarwar right now, I'm pretty peeved, if I'm being honest with you.
And his speech was quite downbeat yesterday, I thought, actually. It was quite low energy, I thought.
6 months ago, I'm looking at, I've got the keys to
Yeah,
Bute House.
sure.
He'd never say that publicly. But now he's going, I've got a real fight in my hands.
Yeah.
And I'm not being helped out by my colleagues down at Westminster. But the fundamentals are absolutely right that you point out. You know, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the country is run just now. And that's borne out from various polls, but also the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, which I'm going to put directly to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister in our discussion. And so they have to now think, be bold in my opinion, fight this as if they're going to lose it. Don't fight this as if you've got a win to protect. That's the biggest mistake you can make in politics.
Because,
go out to try and win it. And I want to see what they're going to do next. And that's so important for what we're about to discuss.
Because politics right now is moving faster than it's ever moved before.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been involved in this since 2002 now, so most of devolution. I've never seen the big swings and the big changes in politics as quickly as we're seeing them just now. You're right. So 6 months ago, we're talking about an Sarwar measuring the curtains, right? And now, at the start of the year before the election, we're talking about him making a downbeat speech. Who knows what's going to be happening in 6 months' time? A lot can change. A lot can change.
Reform.
Yeah.
In one word. Okay, we've seen the rise of reform in England. It wasn't really materialising in Scotland. It seems to be materialising now in Scotland as well. That is evidence to the point that there's a lot to play for. Who knows what's going to happen? It doesn't look, early indications, that the reform's taken votes from the SNP, more so from the unionist parties. But that could change if they hit on a message that really, really chimes with people, which is why it's so important that these two recognise that and be bold, as I say.
So hearing the context then of what sort of things we want to talk about with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, what else do we want to draw out of the discussion, do you think, guys? What other sort of topics, issues, strategies, what else do we want to hear?
Well, we're going to get into a lot more meat, I think, today in terms of what their actual vision is on policy. Because at the end of the day, this is, we're not doing that well as a country. So we do need to understand what the level of ambition is. We have had a return of competence, okay? And that's good. I'm not saying that's a bad thing to get a return of competence. But we don't have ambition yet, I don't think. I'm not saying they don't have it. I think we've not been it's not been articulated what that ambition is yet. And I'd really like to see that over the next year or so, not just by John and Kate, but by Anas Sarwar as well, to be honest with you. I want to see what the level of ambition actually is. What are the big things that they are planning that are going to take this struggling country to the next level?
I wonder, Jeff, if they will be expecting any questions on energy-related policy.
Not from this podcast.
Look, yes.
Yeah.
In a word, yes. And I think that's really important. Look, you know, the oil and gas sector, let's just get out front, contributed, Scottish proportion, almost 10 billion 2 years ago. It was 5 billion last year. It's a massive cut. And then you saw the fiscal position of Scotland dramatically change, almost directly related to that. I want to know how they're going to support that sector, but most importantly, support that sector and the supply chain that it needs to accelerate renewables. I talk about it all the time. This is the biggest economic opportunity Scotland's had in generations. Moreover, I want to talk about the budget, just in a little bit more detail. They talk, you know, John Swinney yesterday talked about economic growth, growing the economy. That's what he wants to do. Does his budget actually do that? I think we need to tease that out of him as well.
Do you know what, Callum? I don't know if do you fact check Jeff's oil and gas numbers, or do we just presume that they're... It's lucky we're not subject to broadcasting rules on this podcast, because he just, you know...
I am going to quote verifiable statistics, okay, today.
In Jeff we trust. He brings the data. That's what you can listen out for. I should just say as well, if this is your first time listening to this podcast or watching the podcast on YouTube, you are very welcome. Press subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. You'd be very welcome to stick around as we start 2025 with, about 18 months to go until the next Scottish parliamentary election. This is the only podcast that will bring you inside Scottish politics. We're kicking off the year in conversation with John Swinney and Kate Forbes. We're recording today in the library of the Resident Hotel in Edinburgh, and you will hear exclusively from the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, only on Holyrood Sources next. This is the Holyrood Sources podcast, and today we're bringing you a special, exclusive conversation with both the First Minister and Deputy First Ministers of Scotland, John Swinney and Kate Forbes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
To be here, Colin.
Great to see you. And we think this is the first time you've done a joint conversation. It's not an interview, it's a conversation.
We do speak.
No, I'm sure. Sorry, I should say it.
It needed Holyrood Sources for you to actually speak.
We have had other conversations.
There goes my first question. It's really lovely to see you both. Thank you both for being here. Right, we're recording on Tuesday the 7th of January, and I feel we should start with the budget, given there's been some movement even today. First Minister, should we now stop worrying about medicines being rationed? That was your warning yesterday, but it seems Anas Sarwar may have sent the budget over the finish line today.
Well, it's certainly changing the Labour position, and if it turns out that that's what transpires over the course of the budget process, then that'll be welcome, because that will ensure the government's budget passes. But, you know, I'm long enough in the tooth to have sat in Parliament when I thought a budget was going to go through and it tied 64-64 and didn't go through. So, you know, where I will be reassured, and the reassurance I'm seeking, of course, is because I want to be able to take forward the government's programme and to address the public's priorities, is when I hear the presiding officer saying that the budget bill has passed and we can get on with implementing the priorities that lie at the heart of the government's programme.
It's going to happen though, isn't it?
What we've done, you know, I specified two things were to happen with the budget to Shona Robertson, who's done a superb job in leading the budget process. The first was that I wanted a budget that would be entirely aligned with the government's programme, so that we could focus on our four priorities of boosting the economy, eradicating child poverty, managing the transition to net zero, and improving our public services. But secondly, I wanted the budget to be as broad and as inclusive as it could within Parliament. So Shona and Ivan McKee, the Public Finance Minister, have listened with care to the perspectives of other parties. So other parties were very, you know, were very insistent, understandably, for there to be a much stronger local government settlement. They wanted to make sure that we made progress on the housing agenda, for example. So in the government's proposals, we've responded to that. You know, we've given a real terms increase to core local government funding. We've given a big increase in investment in housing. So the purpose of the budget was actually to do something more than just put in place financial arrangements. It's part of the leadership I want to give to Parliament through my work as First Minister and in leading the government, is to essentially create much more agreement and to recognise that we're a minority government. We can't just snap our fingers and put a budget through because we don't have the votes to do that. We've got to reach other people. And I think the quality and the depth of the conversations that we are having give me more confidence. I said this yesterday, that I remained confident about the budget going through. But if every single political party that's not the SNP said we're not voting for this budget, the budget wouldn't go through.
Yeah.
And all of what I set out yesterday would have been in play as being potential difficulties in the running and the operation of public services. So if we're getting to a position, I had an exchange with Willie Rennie today in Parliament, where Willie Rennie asked me in the debate, was my door still open to discussions, given the fact that Labour had announced this morning that, actually yesterday they didn't announce they were abstaining, but they're announcing today that they're abstaining. Willie Rennie asked me if my door was still open for discussions, and I told him unreservedly it was, because I want to build as much agreement as possible, because I think our politics today, frankly, need people coming together an awful lot more than has been the case in recent years, and that's what my leadership and what Kate and I want to try to create within Parliament is all about.
Well, on that, and that's really into the door's still open. Deputy First Minister, if I could put to you, it's reported that you could get Labour on side, that they would vote in favour of the budget if it had concrete plans for lifting the two-child cap on benefits as soon as possible. And they're kind of pointing to what Shona Robinson announced last month as something of a kind of aspiration. It's actually not anything concrete. So will there be concrete plans on the two-child benefit cap, and you could have Labour sailing this thing through for you?
Well, there's a huge irony in Labour making that ask, for starters, because obviously in government, in the UK government, they are in government and they're not doing it themselves. But aside from that, it tells you everything you need to know about how serious Labour are about that ask. Because we know, anyone that's been intimately involved with setting up a social security system knows that you need to build systems. So to do that at pace before the beginning of April is just not feasible to do that. So Labour know exactly what they're doing in making that ask. The point that we've set out is that we're willing to do it, and this is the first time that we have a UK government that will work with us to actually give us the data and the systems that we always needed in order to put in place any mitigation to the two-child cap. So, at the end of the day, what we've set out in the budget and has been welcomed by Save the Children, has been welcomed by Shelter, has been welcomed by others, is a plan for next year that will do so much more to tackle child poverty in Scotland than is being done anywhere else in the UK, including under 2 other Labour governments that are currently in government.
Growing the economy underpinned your speech yesterday, and you mentioned it again in your opening remarks there. You also said that you were unreservedly open to discussions on potential further concessions or potential developments. I want to read out to you a quote I picked up on LinkedIn today, and I don't know this guy from Adam, but it's Duncan McConaughey, who's managing director at Lagan. And he says, "We're devastated to have to close our beloved restaurant Gather to the public at the end of this month. We're promised that those in power understand that those who had the strings of power which could make or break hospitality are on our side. That non-domestic rates will be reviewed for hospitality. Well, for many it's too late. Businesses should be supported to thrive, to employ people, to invest and to grow." Now, Duncan, to be fair, goes on to talk about VAT being an issue, not in the responsibility of Holyrood, and he also talks about the national insurance contributions. But he talks about non-domestic rates most importantly. Is there any, now John, you and I work together in government, and sometimes you might have a few quid back down the, back the sofa. So, is there anything that can be done? And we accept that there's it's a huge ask what the hospitality industry is asking for. Is there any halfway house further than what you've committed to today that could help that hospitality industry? Because we're losing jobs and we're losing premises over this.
I understand the points that Duncan is putting forward, and when we looked at the budget provisions, we looked very carefully at what we could afford, and we've got to construct a balanced package that addresses all of the issues that are put to us. So when I look at the discussions we have with, a lot of discussions with stakeholders, a lot of discussions with political parties, and we're trying to, and I'm very serious, we're trying to create as much unity and cohesion about the budget proposal as we possibly can do. But we've also got the limits of affordability that we've got to think about as well. And I frankly can't promise things that we're unable to deliver or that we can't afford. Now, I think without understanding all of the dynamics of the case, but I would be very surprised if employers' national insurance contributions are not a big factor in what Duncan is wrestling with. And I am very worried about the effect of employers' national insurance contributions. When I was, I've been around these debates for a long time. When I was growing up as a boy, employers' national insurance contributions was called a tax on jobs. That was its shorthand. So you never touched it because that was a tax on jobs. And here is a Labour government which has got elected, I think foolishly, closing down so many options. The public services needed more investment. It's clear to me that, and I made that at this point during the election campaign, but they closed down all the options. They closed down a variety of different choices about income tax and all sorts of other things. And they've alighted on employers' national insurance contributions, and I think it contradicts their agenda on growth. And we'll pay a price for it in Scotland. So what we've done, and I was very pleased yesterday, Scottish Retail Consortium encouraged members of Parliament to vote for the budget because they described it as imperfect. But I noticed that their director used words to the effect that he was confident that ministers got it, that ministers were hearing, ministers understood. And that's exactly where I want my ministers to be. I want my ministers to be perceived as understanding what business and the economy requires. That's why I've got such confidence in what Kate's doing, leading that debate for us within the economy, changing minds and attitudes to see the government as an ally in encouraging growth within the economy. And we'll do as much as we can, Jeff, but what I can't do is I can't promise people things I can't afford.
So longer term though, just on this specific issue, and I accept the arguments on national insurance contributions, but longer term, are you willing to look at the issue of non-domestic rates? Because I tell you, and Stephen Montgomery of the Scottish Hospitality Group has made this point and made it at the budget breakfast that you were at, Kate. Is this something that you could look at longer term? Is this something you could see in a manifesto for the next elections? Because businesses are closing.
Right, so here's an answer. So I worked quite a lot with Duncan during COVID. So we designed together a wedding fund that would get businesses like his through COVID when they were absolutely struggling and jobs were on the line. So we've got a lot of these businesses through COVID with specific funding, and we need to get them through what has been big energy price hikes, inflation impacts, changing nature of consumer habits, not least when it comes to weddings, and it's challenging. It wasn't that long ago that we did have a review of non-domestic rates. So I would make the point that actually we have led on reviewing non-domestic rates, and it wasn't that long ago that we accepted the recommendations, implemented them, and have made the changes. The big challenge we have in Scotland with non-domestic rates is that the business space is just completely different from in England. So the Labour government have set out plans to change non-domestic rates down south that will look completely different. So they're basically looking at a much higher number of big businesses that will be able to fund tax breaks for wee businesses. In Scotland, it's mostly wee businesses. It's mostly small and medium-sized businesses. So we've said, and Shona Robison said it last year in the budget bill, we've said consistently that we are very open, particularly to changing the methodology on hospitality. The key is getting something that everyone can get behind and that everyone agrees with and everybody supports. And that's always been the sticking point when it comes to changing the methodology for non-domestic rates in hospitality.
We'll come back to some of the more specific policy issues in the budget, but let me reverse a little bit to the politics of it as opposed to the policy of it. Because I'm not minimising how hard it is to get a budget passed in a minority parliament, but we are...
You've never done it.
Never done it. Never been close. It's not an issue I've had to wrestle with over the years, to be said. It's fine.
And I can't resist. It's
we've also you've done it as well.
Yeah.
Come on. But we're sort of 6-7 weeks out and we now know that it's going to go through as good as. And I think it was going to go through anyway, partly because it was a very clever political budget, and the reach out to the Lib Dems in particular has been quite clear. And I think there was a good relationship building there anyway. Is it not an advert though? Because you've now, you've reached across the constitutional divide in that sense. With discussions with the Lib Dems. Not all that popular inside the bubble, but very popular out in the country, I think, for parties from different constitutional backgrounds to work together. Is this not an advert for why minority government actually can be very useful and can work very well, especially when you don't have to get that many votes to get over the line? I mean, is it not a better model, frankly, than we had under the Bute House Agreement?
Well, I think I think it's important to look at this in a slightly longer context. When Alec Cole-Hamilton spoke just before me, when I spoke to accept office as First Minister, Alex said that the votes of the Liberal Democrats remained available for a change of government. That was 7 months ago. And so I was starting off leading a government with the leader of the Liberal Democrats saying our votes are still available to bring down this Parliament and get a new government in place. We've worked strenuously to change the atmosphere in Holyrood and to do exactly what you're saying. Because what I then went on to say in my acceptance speech as First Minister was that I made an appeal to Parliament, but it's because we were just going back into a minority government situation with the Bute House Agreement had ended about maybe 10 days beforehand, and I'd then become First Minister. I made a remark in my acceptance speech where I made an appeal to people to avoid the constitutional divide, which I accept polarises opinion, getting in the way of us facing the realities that you put to me, Andy, about the fact that as a minority government we've got to work with others to get things done. And the examples I used were about passing legislation or passing a budget. So I take an awful lot of, I want to pay tribute to other parties because other parties have contributed willingly into the process. There have been good discussions, and indeed because parties were open in the discussions, my ministers have been able to listen. I told them listen to what they're saying. We listened to their points of view, and we deliberately constructed a budget that would be a unifying budget. So it was one of the express directions I put into the budget process. Try to bring people together. And Shona Robertson and Ivan McKee have managed to do that by the choices that they made, by listening carefully to others. So there is I suppose I've got conflicted opinions about your proposition that you put to me. One bit of me is the utterly pragmatic part of me, which just says, well, if the electorate throws up minority government, you get on with minority government because people want you to serve them and to act wisely. And I've got a pretty formidable amount of experience personally in navigating my way through all that. The other bit of me is I'm a politician, I like to win the election. I like to win as many seats as I would like to. So you're never going to sit on this comfortable sofa and persuade me that I shouldn't be aspiring to form a majority, Andy. But if the public throw up a minority, they can rely on John Swinney to make it work.
I mean, I've also got a lot of experience in minority. It's just not the government that comes after it.
Can I just I know you're both avid listeners of the podcast.
The First Minister's asking for one of our cushions.
He is.
Well,
I know.
I wouldn't quite go that far. I think I'm being misquoted in my enthusiasm. I simply made a comment about the rather attractive or otherwise cushions.
Yeah, but look, I've said many times when the breakup of the Bute House Agreement took place that the SNP should not fear minority government if they play the politics right. And you won't have heard us in our introduction to this, but I did pay tribute to the fact I think you played the politics very well, and I don't want to go into that much because I think I'm schmoozing you enough. But I want to ask you this one simple question: minority government as it is right now, is that better than the Bute House Agreement?
Well, there's moments in different times, and as I said in my response to Andy a second ago, I pragmatically deal with the way things are in front of me. There's a lot of things. You see, if I go back to moments in the Bute House Agreement, it was possible to make headway on issues by negotiation with the Greens. So you had a situation where you could because everybody was kind of bound into the agreement, you had a natural willingness to find a solution. And that generally was my experience, a willingness to find a solution. Some days were more difficult than others.
But just on that, sorry, First Minister, but just on that, there's not much left of the Bute House Agreement in public policy landscape just now. I mean, we think about the deposit return scheme.
If I had my time again, we'd be doing a deposit return scheme, because the deposit return scheme was an act
If you
of
had
total.
your time again, would you do the Bute House Agreement?
You're asking me two different questions. That was a moment in time where it came along, and we'd had a terrible experience in the 2016 to 2021 Parliament. It was really difficult to get anything done. People were worn out by the fact that the government had a period of majority, and then we were in a minority 2016 to 2021, and it was really difficult to get things done. And some not particularly great decisions were arrived at. Let me give you an example. In the 2016 to 2021 Parliament, legislation was passed about action on climate change, which set new targets for climate action. And the government's original proposal was for a certain level of targets to be achieved. The Committee on Climate Change, the independent committee, said what essentially gave the government the evidence for the targets that we put into legislation. Parliament, Conservatives, Liberals, Greens, Labour, all got together and said these targets are not enough, we're going to have to go higher. So we eventually had to go higher. Now, the evidence didn't support it. The Committee on Climate Change said that's not a good thing to do. You won't be able to achieve that. What have we had to do? We've had to go back into legislation. Gillian Martin has stewarded legislation through to revise those targets. That actually was one of the contributory factors to the demise of the Bute House Agreement. So I think you've got to look at different periods and different times to make a judgment about what's going to work. We're in a situation now when a minority government will be in a minority government until 2026. I reserve my position about the 2026 election outcome. I'm despite your call, I'm going to go into it to try to win a majority in that election.
Okay,
but
let me just jump in,
that
because I think we need to ask the same question to the Deputy First
Absolutely,
Minister.
and I've got an answer, which is something that connects an answer to Andy's question about the value or otherwise of minority government and the difference. Often people look to the government to act in a mature way. You hold us to account, you scrutinise us for what we do and what we don't do. What is missing is whether or not the other parties are mature enough to rise to the occasion with ideas, with a pragmatism and a willingness to engage collaboratively. Now, I know, Andy, you have frequently called on other parties, not least the Lib Dems, over the years, to engage constructively. And I've often said to stakeholders when it's been minority government, look, you want X, Y and Z? Well, don't just come and appeal to me, in that case as Finance Secretary, to introduce that. You go speak to the other parties in this minority administration. And I completely agree with the First Minister that towards the end of the 2016-21 term, things had completely disintegrated. It was pure politics. Mm-hmm. I mean, those last few years, I was trying to get budget deals through. It was, coming up to the election.
So then, minority government is better than the Bute House Agreement.
And you need
right
to get
now.
Things through.
That's
at the end of the day, this is what connects what the First Minister said yesterday about populism. At the end of the day, people are sick to the back teeth of politics not delivering, and they go looking for extremes when it doesn't deliver. You've got to deliver.
Excuse me from asking the obvious question though, but surely from your perspective, minority government's better than the Bute House Agreement, because with the Bute House Agreement, given the pronouncements of Patrick Harvey about your own person, you wouldn't be the Deputy First Minister and you wouldn't be in the government at all.
I want to deliver for the people. At the end of the day, we've got, 18 months to the next election? My name is going to be in the ballot paper in 2026 in my constituency. I need to be able to prove what I've delivered, both at a government level and at a local level. And at the end of the day, I stood in a manifesto, the SNP's manifesto to deliver. I'm going to be held to account for what we deliver. And the next 18 months is all about delivery.
So I think that gets us on to a very interesting point about that, because when you guys came in, it was pretty much 2 years till the election at that point. 2 years is not that long a time, actually, in order to show, it's plenty of time for words, but it's not that long for action. Mm-hmm. And if you look at this budget, I mean, it's a clever and sensible and pragmatic budget, and I think it's a good budget because it provides you mentioned David Lonsdale's words earlier, that ministers get it. I think this is a budget that shows the government gets it, understands where we are. But it's not, I wouldn't describe it as an ambitious budget. I think it's a very competent budget that shows that we're going to move in the right direction. But if you look at, you had 8-9 months, people inside the bubble, we totally understand that this is a very different government to what existed before. I think out there in the country, probably nothing has changed in terms of their day-to-day lives yet. That's not a criticism as such, because it's not been very long. But I think by the time we get to the election, there will have to be some indication that there's actually a change on the ground in what people are feeling. So the queues are still the same at A&E as they were this time last year. The situation in schools is the same as it was this time last year. TAC is the same as it was this time last year. There's still as many potholes as there were this time last year. So in terms of actual action, there hasn't yet been that change that makes people say, oh, I can see why this is working, and I think we should have this continue. And I just wonder if there's room in the next year for a bit more ambition rather than just words.
I think if you look at, like, I disagree with you about the point of ambition, because the budget's intensely focused on delivering good for people in Scotland. So, yesterday at the event that I addressed in Edinburgh, there was a representative of Shelter there who've been very, very critical of the government about its approach on housing, and was very, very supportive of the government's action, because what the government is doing is two things. One, we're spending more money on housing and addressing the housing emergency, but we're also deploying a flexibility and a pragmatism to get more housing stock activated in the short term. Now, they've not heard that. Now that's just a change of approach by the government. The government's listened and we've acted, and stakeholders are saying, wait a minute. So it's not just David Lonsdale and the Scottish Realty Consortium, it's other people who are noticing that as well. Now, in tax, there's an issue which, again, these things have not really been much line of sight, but people will feel it. We've eased the tax burden on middle income earners as a consequence of the tax decisions that Shona Robertson made in the budget. I think that's a welcome thing. Yeah. So that's so we've just eased that burden, so people will feel the benefit of that. Now, the budget is designed. I said yesterday, the budget is set in the mainstream of Scottish public opinion. That's where I've always sat. It's where I always wanted my beloved party to be, and that's where I found it and got it into that kind of place that, as a party of mainstream public opinion, it would be successful. And that's where I think we're heading just now.
Fundamentally disagree on two counts, unless you're going to ask me a different question.
No, carry on.
The first is how people feel, and the second is what they see. So I think my impression, and we've had quite a few by-elections to fight over the last few months, so there's been no shortage of conversations. I'll tell you, one of the
They've not gone that well, the by-elections.
Well, actually, if you look at some of the figures...
I might send you a wee note on that.
Yeah.
Please do.
Because if you look at some of the figures, but what you're seeing, what you're hearing from people is a real sense that actually, wait a minute, we're starting to talk their language again. They feel like they can have a bit more confidence. And what I've always said is that the SNP's always won on the basis of it being a truly national party. In other words, it can win in the north of Scotland, and it can win in the south of Scotland. It can win in the rural areas and the urban areas, and people are starting to feel that again. But then it's what they see. So I drive the infamous A9 every single week, twice a week actually, and there are contractors working there, sorting out the Moy to Tomatin route. You can see it. In the budget, for the first time, the Belford Hospital was referenced. There'll be money there. So actually, people are starting to see things, and there's nothing like bricks and mortar to make them feel like things are moving in the right direction.
I don't disagree with that. I'm not. I said in the piece we referenced that I wrote in the Herald last week, there's an absolute calming, and there's an understanding that the people who are now running the country understand where it needs to go. My point is that it's not that long a timescale for people to actually see real meaningful change on the ground, and I do think that might potentially become an issue.
Well, I think that's a not unreasonable point, Andy. But essentially, what was I talking about yesterday? Delivery today, hope for tomorrow. So that's going to be the structure of what I'm saying to the country. I want to deliver progress for Scotland, and that will be done by delivery for today and offering hope for tomorrow.
Lots to get on to. Just on by-elections, I had a little look at the council by-election record for 2024, and this analysis is by Ballot Box Scotland. The SNP defending 14, gained 1, held 4, lost 10. So that's a net loss of -9 compared to the 2022 winner.
So if you look
that's what I meant by it didn't go that
if,
well.
If you look at, you've got to look at this within a single transferable vote system. And the issue that you'll find from looking at by-elections in the latter part of 2024 is that the SNP was polling very high when those seats were originally fought in 2022. The Labour Party was very low. What you see now is our vote has stabilised and the Labour vote is way down. That's my point. That's what's changed.
Okay.
So in the summer,
I hear you.
we got hammered in the general elections.
Yeah.
What you see now, and you've seen it electorally, is that Labour is slumped. Now, we're not growing enough. I accept that. We're not growing enough. We're not where I need us to be, but we're closer to where I need us to be than we were when I took over in the summer.
Interesting. We've got lots to get through. Believe it or not, energy will feature on this podcast in a little bit. We want to talk a little bit about independence in a moment or two. But on that point of delivering for people, Jeff.
Yeah, well, Kate, I think you said voters vote with what they feel and see, right? And I want to just take us back as to why the SNP was coming from such a low nadir as was the hammering in the general election, as you put it. And I did a little bit of research, unlike me, I know. The Scottish Social Attitudes Survey, 2011, 71% trusted the Scottish Government to act in Scotland's best interests. I chose 2011 because that was the year that, in my opinion, transformed Scottish politics. That led to the majority, that therefore led to the independence referendum, which really did transform Scottish politics in this country. In 2023, the most latest survey we have, results for us 47%. That's down 24%. Now, in my opinion, the framing of the next election is going to be key. Anna Sarwar is going to say to you, look at all these things, the delivery, the metrics, they're not going in the direction that they want. To Andy's point, are they achievable in the next 15 months? Our best calling card back then, John, was that we were competent, seen as competent. And you take NHS for one example. 2011, 56% were very or quite satisfied with the way the NHS is run. 2023 is 23%. That's a drop of 33%. Why is that? What's gone wrong in the intervening years? Accept the actions that you're taking. I think most ardent critics would accept that the ship is getting steady. I think your most ardent critics would accept that. But why are we coming from such a low level in 2023?
Well, there's a lot of factors that have, a lot of things have happened in amongst that, Jeff. The cumulative effect of austerity, and this is why I'm prepared to take the tough decisions about tax, why I fought the election campaign on the fact that the public finances had to be restored, is that there's been a lot of delusion about the ability to pursue an austerity agenda and also want high quality public services. It just doesn't work. It's total rubbish. And if you want an insight into that, I went and study the 44 days of the total stupidity that was Liz Truss's Prime Minister. That sums it all up. So don't give me a kind of harangue about competence in government when a United Kingdom government was able to deliver that total car crash on the whole of the United Kingdom, of which we're still paying the price for all of that. So factors such as the cumulative effect of austerity, the interruption to our health service because of COVID, which, if you look at the 2021 election, the SNP got an outstanding result in the 2021 election. Why? I think because of the way we had stewarded the country through COVID. I think that was the country's expression of confidence in us. We're living with the aftermath of the combination of austerity, Brexit, COVID, and the energy price spike that is coming. And that's what's having an effect on people's confidence. And we've got to address that. That's why, I said, as I've come back into government, I've got government focused on what people are concerned about. Because that's where you start your rebuild from. Because if you understand, if you actually take time to listen to people, and I've spent all my days listening to folk. That's why I sit in village halls in Perthshire every Friday, listening to to the people who've given me the honour of representing them to hear what they're saying. And if you listen to folk, that's where you can start your rebuilding.
Can I offer just a wee quick follow-up? Sorry, Callum. And to Kate, if I may, because through those 2 years and every intervening year, the most top priority given by the people of Scotland is what they want to see is growing the economy. Now, I put it to you that potentially that I was off the ball in that particular space. In the census, both 2011 2023, growing the economy remains the top priority, 36 and 42%. Sorry, the other way around, 42% and 36% respectively. And I'm putting to you, have we had enough focus as a country, as a government, on growing the economy?
So what does growing the economy mean? It actually means people feeling like their living standards are improving, they feel like they can make ends meet, and they feel like their aspiration has value. And what I would suggest is that at the root of what you've just put to me is the fact that across Western democracies right now, the rarest commodity is trust. Trust because people have felt left behind, they've been let down, right across the board. So when you single out Scotland, my argument would be you have to look wider than Scotland. So right across the UK, in fact, right across quite a number of countries, our economic prosperity has not grown at the pace that it should. But more than that, people's living standards have essentially stagnated. So people are not seeing the value. You know, we've got great industrial growth in Scotland. We've got huge opportunity when it comes to energy, which I know we'll come on to. Huge opportunity, but if people don't feel it, I think that makes them feel disempowered, left behind, and it is an issue right across the board.
I think that's an important point, just very briefly on the NHS. I think that's an important point on the NHS. The NHS polling numbers will not be exclusive to Scotland, it will be the same throughout the UK. You said yesterday, actually, in your speech, John, about access being the problem. When you get into the NHS, we're actually very good, and that's true. We've got very good medical schools in this country, we've got very good teaching hospitals. It's actually good when you get in. I think it's an entirely bigger issue. Access is not solved by money. Access is a systemic problem in the NHS, and it needs reform before that can be improved, not money. But what it does come on to, I think, that relates to what you've said, and it really comes on to the whole argument about independence, which we'll get on to now anyway, is that actually the prospects for independence are always best served by a high-performing devolved government. If Scots see their devolved government, a nationalist devolved government, doing well, inevitably they are better disposed towards the possibility of independence. And I think that goes for huge numbers of people in the middle who are not card-carrying nationalists or unionists, who are just people who would pretty much vote for what they think is going to be best for them and their family on balance. Lots of people did that in 2014, and they would do it again. But the best way to turn those people from no voters to yes voters is to just do well in terms of how you run the country.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And in the interest of fairness,
but that hasn't. I mean, that has been going in reverse, right?
Yeah. No. I
think go back. Let's go back to Jeff's comment that even our harshest critics would indicate that the government is sure-footed. It's moving forward. It's got a clear agenda. It's able to communicate.
Yeah.
Well, we are.
Hold on. In response to that question, I'm going to look to your advisors behind you. I mean, you've really missed the ball here, guys. I mean, these response was, but confidence in Westminster is much lower than in the Scottish Government in both of those surveys. Much lower, 18 and 21%. But you're much higher. And you're absolutely right. But I think the reason I raised that.
Yeah, because I don't take recourse in these bits of comfort, because that's not good enough for me. And I don't. If you watch how I handle first minister's questions, I don't handle them on that basis.
Yeah, but the reason I raised the question, John, and I accept that point. I'm just more, having a go at your advisors. As you know, I used to do that job. But the serious point is, I think this is the framing of the election. So Sawar is going to go for you on your devolved record since 2007. Right, and say things have got worse. And I've always believed that people will turn to the SNP if they're standing up for Scotland's interests, if people feel they are. Now, we've got dated figures here, that's the latest figures we have, and I'm just pointing out the challenge. If you could present that, surely that's going to put you in the strongest position to win the election in 2026.
Well, I don't think data like that is what will turn people's views.
But no, surely if more people feel that you're standing up for Scotland's interests, the two of you and your government, then you're going to win the election.
Well, of course.
So do you agree that those figures are alarming, therefore?
Well, I'm not. I'm actually, I'm addressing those because of the actions that we're taking. I'm also, one of the other things which I felt, when I made my speech to say I was going to come back into the frame down at the Grassmarket community venture, and I got asked a question which was basically on the premise that, we've got a poor record as a government. And I responded to that by setting out all the various things of which I'm very proud that the government is doing. So I've just delivered a speech in Parliament today. There's 100,000 children being kept out of poverty, 60,000 of them because of an innovation that we brought in, only us in Scotland, the Scottish Child Payment, no other part of the United Kingdom is doing it. So we've got that. 1,140 hours of free early learning childcare for 3 and 4 year olds in our country. That's the best early learning childcare offer in the United Kingdom, brought in by this SNP government, sustained. School buildings, you talked about education a second ago. Andy, when the Labour Party left office in 2007, 63% of our school buildings in Scotland were in a satisfactory or good condition. That's over 90%, despite 14 years of austerity under decisions that we took, and principally I took, to make sure that our kids are educated in lovely surroundings.
I suppose Labour would point to attainment levels, as well on education.
Yes, and attainment levels, Callum, are at the lowest, are at the narrowest gap in attainment levels they've ever been at, as a consequence of the actions.
Where are they in comparison? So if they're at their narrowest gap, where are they compared to 20 years ago for pupils in Scotland?
Well, they're
Are they more literate now? Are they more numerate now?
Well, you're forgetting it's the poverty-related attainment
exactly.
gap.
So I'm talking the gap.
It's linked to deprivation.
Yeah, exactly.
And whose job is it to fix deprivation?
Well, that's where it's our responsibility to do what we can in terms of Scottish Health payment. But you have to understand the context. I mean, it's pretty clear that most of the macroeconomic levers are not within our grasp. And also, in terms of most of the welfare powers are not within our grasp.
On that note,
you can own the things that you're responsible for.
I do think that we can sometimes get. I'm not minimising the importance of school buildings. My kids are in a new one, so it's lovely, right? But what goes on inside them is more important than what they look like on the outside, I think. Yeah, actually, ironically, there's not much to talk about in terms of the Tory record in government in Westminster over the last 14 years, but actually, state school level attainment is probably going to be their best legacy of the last 14 years. It has consistently improved in England over the last 14 years by international standards, and ours has not. Ours has gone down, certainly according to PISA. Whether we think PISA is accurate or not, in fairness, I think we do have to focus more on what's going on inside the buildings than what the buildings themselves
I'm simply giving you an illustration of the record that we've delivered as a consequence of our interventions. And what I'm not going to do, and that's why I cited back to being prepared to go on the front foot to defend our record when I said I was coming back into leadership. I'm not going to sit about and have our record in office denigrated on the way that Jeff has just put to me. That might well be the narrative that I hear. I'm pushing back on that every single occasion it's put to me, because we have got of course there are issues that have got to be addressed, performance that's got to be improved, but there's a lot of good stuff that's happened as a consequence of the SNP government, and I'll be sharing that with the electorate, which will be an essential part of how we build confidence around us in the 2026 election.
Onwards, because I wonder if part of your election strategy, in fact I don't wonder, I know that part of your election strategy has to be based around independence. Deputy First Minister, can you outline for us what your plan is to achieve independence?
So I think the first and primary responsibility we have is to inspire hope. So the next election is going to be a question of what Scotland's future looks like. And I really don't think we can overemphasise at the moment the risks of extremism and the risks of populism. So when people feel left behind, as I've just outlined, that I think they do, because living standards haven't increased, because of systematic failures that affect the United Kingdom and other Western democracies. Because of that, people feel left behind. And they will listen to voices that simplify the solutions to quite an alarming extent and pose dangerous solutions. So it's the immigrant to blame for absolutely everything. Divide communities, divide societies, lead to an increase in hate and all the rest of it. And on the other side, we have a responsibility to outline a better alternative. And First Minister said yesterday in his speech that we can fix everything that's wrong in Scotland with everything that's right in Scotland. We know we have got everything that it takes. We know that we are going to power, for example, the road to net zero. We know we have the energy resources. We know they have the skills, the talent. You know, if Ireland's looking at the moment this year at a budget surplus that they don't know how to spend, the point is that we plucky countries can do a great job if they believe in themselves. And that is an alternative future that is filled with hope, it's filled with aspiration, filled with ambition, filled with prosperity. And the route to independence is about outlining that alternative that can inspire. Now, we need to ensure that people believe us. And that is where trust comes in. And what the First Minister has done over the last 6 months, trying to bring people together, of setting out a competent, straightforward approach to delivery, is the answer to the trust point. Combine those two, and I think you've got an electric solution.
So is it more about that? I mean, I think that's an interesting point. And it comes back a little bit to the timescales I was talking about earlier. 2026, using that logic, will be at least as much about, look, this is where we're going, as much as it's about, look at what we've done in the last couple of years. You're going to have to be pretty heavy on, you've got to trust us, we must have proven something to you over the last couple of years, and now look at all this stuff we've got planned, which kind of comes back to a point I made about the really, really high-level, big, ambitious, 10, 20, 30-year plans that I think people would respond well to. But it's going to have to be heavy on that because there's not enough time to actually...
It's got to be heavy on that because of what's at stake. I mean, there's a lot at stake in the next election about where we go. And you just go back to those by-elections.
Yeah.
You look at the support for reform that's increasing. You look at what's been in the news this week. There's a lot at stake in 2026.
Can I just say, though, based on what you've said, the immediate perception of that is that almost feels like a step one on the route to independence. Fine. But then I don't know how you get to step two. Am I missing something?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, sold. As a committed nationalist, sold. What you just said, brilliant. Made
it's not
me...
just nationalists that would be sold on that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the point I was trying to make earlier, right?
Yeah.
The point is you want more people to be sold on that vision.
And
if we can convince Andy, then we're halfway there.
I'm sold on the vision. And I hate to talk too much process, but we've been promised referendum after referendum regularly over the last 10 years. We've gone to the Supreme Court. We now know by law that that Holyrood is not permitted to the UK government does not have to give consent to that referendum. How do you convince Westminster if the independence referendum is your preferred route? What is your preferred route? How are you going to make the case for independence? What's going to be in the manifesto? I accept we're not going to get the detail just now. But how is it going to be different to what's gone before, First Minister? How is it going to be different to gone before?
Well, what I've said consistently is that Scottish independence will only come about, whatever discussion we have about routes and process, when there's an emphatic desire for Scottish independence. And that's exactly what the Deputy First Minister has just talked about how we inspire people to believe in that concept of independence and why that will have the transformative effect on our lives, that we as believers in independence think that's going to be the case. And that's got to be at the heart of how we promote the arguments for independence, how we use those international comparisons, how we demonstrate good governance within Scotland, how we show people that there are many good things can be done in Scotland and there are many more things could be done that are good for Scotland if we had the powers of independence. So that's about, and if I look back over political history, and there's a very easy conclusion to come to. Nothing ever happens on the constitutional question unless the SNP is doing really well. And that's the hard reality of life. So we've got to get people to buy into an inspiring vision of independence and see voting SNP as the means to catalyse that and to make it happen. And ultimately, in a democracy, Westminster cannot stand in the way of the people of Scotland determining their own future. And that's
measured by what, though? So the Northern Irish...
Because in a democratic context, that cannot be. If you take in the context of Northern Ireland, for example, there is an accepted
So that's what I was saying.
point.
Is this what you were talking
so there's
about
an
in the second
accepted point about there is a route by which this issue is addressed.
Yeah.
So if there's an acceptance that there is a route by which this can be addressed for Northern Ireland, there has to be an acceptance of a route for Scotland. That cannot be
is that
resisted.
route, though,
and that's my point to you, Callum. That is just a logical democratic inconsistency that can't be
But
sustained.
do you like that? So that particular route, which
I'm
is
not
effectively...
talking. I'm talking about the fact that there is an accepted
That there isn't a
route,
route. Ah,
and that's. So I'm not pontificating about the route. I'm talking about the fact there is an acceptance that there's a route, a pathway, and that cannot be resisted. That cannot be accepted in Northern Ireland, and somehow.
So you would discuss with Starmer some sort of codification of a route?
These are issues that we've got to consider as to how we progress. But fundamentally, it will only come when there is political impetus behind the campaign for independence. And that's what we are working to make sure is the case.
Was Nicola Sturgeon wrong to refer all of this to the Supreme Court in the first place?
I mean, if you look back over the last few years, the fundamental thing that is wrong is the denial of democracy. So at the end of the day, it should be really obvious that when people vote for a party to be in power and in their manifesto, they set out what they will do in power,
So
like having a referendum.
You disagree with the Supreme Court
I think it's really clear that that is the route forward, and over that period of time, the SNP made a number of attempts to go down that route, and that was one of them.
Mm-hmm. So was it a mistake, do you think, First Minister?
Wasn't a mistake. Because you've got to, we've got to, and we have, explore every avenue possible to advance the ability to deliver on the mandate that was being expressed by the people of Scotland. But I come back to my fundamental point. You will only deny democracy if you're not prepared to embrace what we now see as growing levels of support for Scottish independence as expressed in a consistent set of polls at a higher level than has been the case for some considerable time.
But that will, so just to be clear, in your manifesto, you will have a clear route map as to what your preferred vision of how you achieve independence.
Just to remind you of what you said a few minutes ago, we're not going to be writing our manifesto.
I know, but I mean...
So it was a good and valiant attempt, but it's ultimately flawed and failed.
But you don't have to tell us what it is. Do you know what it is?
I've got a very clear sense about how we need to progress on the constitutional question
And how we can break that logjam. Well, if you had that conversation,
Yes.
yeah, you've had that conversation.
We talk about a lot of things.
So you both know
independence.
So you both know what the route is. You're both on the same page.
We are on the same page.
And that page will be in the manifesto.
Well, that's what Jeff's asking me about what the details of the manifesto are, and I'm just not prepared to do
I mean, it'd be weird if you didn't have independence in your manifesto, wouldn't it? Yeah, fine. Good.
It's hard because, I mean, in my view, I've said this before, there should have been a referendum because I think 2016 was different because it was caveated in the Brexit vote and all that stuff. 2021 was pretty clear. You had a majority for two parties that had identical wording in their manifesto, and it was very clear that it was a vote for a referendum. There should have been one, but I think that belligerence by the UK government, and that's what it was, I think it was democratically unacceptable at the time. It has given the SNP a real difficulty in what the pitch then is, because if all avenues look like they're closed, it makes the pitch hard and raises more answers than questions.
I think it's fundamentally bigger, and it goes back. I'm going to keep banging this drum about trust, because you asked me a question about trust and the dangers of extremism. When people feel left behind, they feel ignored, they don't feel things get delivered. If you look at some of I think it was just before the election, and John Curtis did a piece about trust and the lack of, apathy, disillusionment. And he said that those that believed most in constitutional change felt most left behind by politicians that hadn't been able to deliver on what they wanted to deliver. In other words, people that believed that hope was possible and that things could change felt completely left behind. And that lack of hope, that anxiety, that despair, that is where extremism flourishes. And so the point about denying democracy It's massive.
I
Like,
agree.
it's
I think it
fundamental
was a
to the next election.
Short-term
And
hard
it
for
is-
nationalists,
it's
but
a-
long-term bad for
It's
unionists.
a thread that runs through every single policy, and I think it needs to shift.
And just final point on this, very very quickly. I mean, I recognise the point you make about the SNP, and for what it's worth, I tend to agree with you, First Minister, about being the prominent force for independence. But there are other parties, and one thing I think that the pro-independence campaign did very well in 2014 is speak to all. I don't have much in common with Patrick Harvey, but I certainly respected his ability in that campaign and his views why he supported Scottish independence, and we managed to put that together pretty well. Is there a role for other parties in this independence debate going forward, as you see it? Is there a role for them, and would you support their existence on the list, for example, in 2026?
Well, I think political parties will express their points of view and they'll set out their stall. From my point, as leader of the Scottish National Party, I'll try to get as many people as I possibly can do to vote for the Scottish National Party in every election and give the leadership that we've always given to the constitutional question, because I come back to my fundamental point, Jeff. Nothing happens on the Constitution in Scotland without the Scottish National Party doing really well.
Let's go on. A couple of other topics we want to get through fairly quickly, and I know the Deputy First Minister's got another engagement that she needs to get to shortly. I want to ask about Donald Trump, the new President-elect of the United States, soon to be the actual President. He'll lose a couple of syllables in a couple of weeks' time. Patrick Harvey, formerly a government partner of the SNP, of course, of the Scottish Greens, has really sort of issued a warning. He says, I urge the First Minister and his colleagues, that's you guys among others, to turn down any meeting requests while Donald Trump is here. Would you turn down a meeting request with the President of the United States?
I couldn't do that. I'm the First Minister of Scotland.
Absolutely.
And I'd have to engage with the President of the United States if he wished to engage with me. And I accepted a phone call from President Trump. I thought that was the right thing to do. We had a perfectly cordial conversation. He expressed his very, very deep, enthusiastic admiration for Scotland, and I expressed to him, the topics that matter to us. I took the opportunity to mention the significance of the whisky industry. I didn't raise the issue of tariffs with him, but I was putting the issue of whisky on his radar as it matters to me, and in my role as First Minister, to support key industries in our country. So. I don't think people would understand what I was doing if I refused to meet with the President of the United States.
Yeah.
I think it'd be like playing a round of golf with Donald Trump. Would you'd play golf with Trump, wouldn't you? You both would.
Golf with anyone.
It's good playing at his
I'd
golf
love to
courses.
get on a golf course.
Golf courses are
That child is
absolutely
19
wonderful.
months old. If you do meet him at Many in Aberdeen, right, try and get him to give a few quid to Aberdeen Football Club. Thank you.
Here you go. What a commitment.
That's me done, actually.
That's the whole reason you're here. I suppose my other question, and I really hesitate.
Can I just
Go on.
clarify that by saying okay, I was sort of saying I hear what you're saying, but actually that wasn't a commitment to do anything about it. I
Swinney backs funding.
I just actually feel I should play that. It's just a kind of that was an actual genuine kind of polite bewilderment, but I don't want it to be perceived as any form of solid commitment to you. Just so we know where we stand. Do we?
I also think
So he's
that
against Aberdeen Football Club.
well, I think that diplomacy is what you need to deploy in a meeting with President Trump, isn't it? That's how you deal with him. Yeah, well, indeed. I hesitate to mention Elon Musk's name because the week has already been too dominated by him. But would you work with someone? Would you work specifically with Elon Musk to make Scotland an attractive place for him to invest with Tesla or with X or with any of his other massive companies?
I mean, I think right now it's pretty erratic, and
He's a billionaire. He could invest here.
I think it's pretty erratic. I think the fact that you've got leaders across Europe expressing concern about external interference is quite an alarm bell right now. And I would probably just proceed with caution.
Okay.
And we've got, one of the absolutely bizarre things that Anna Sarma was talking about yesterday was he wants to have a good go at the enterprise development agencies in Scotland. We've got great enterprise development agencies in the Highlands, Hans Enterprise, Scottish Enterprise, and South of Scotland Enterprise, and they act on our behalf in attracting international investment. They do a really good job at that. So I think that's That should give us a lot of confidence that we've got these arrangements well in hand.
The Trump question is easier than the Musk question, right? Trump's the president of the US. It's just that, obviously, he has to be engaged with. There's no question about that at all. The Musk question is more difficult because he is an erratic oligarch, right? But he's also somebody who builds things that are very important to us. So lots of rural Scotland, for example, uses Starlink. It's an excellent service for lots of places that don't have cable broadband. And there's plenty of Teslas driving around here as well. That is a more difficult question. If he did want to build a factory here, I don't think we could immediately just say we don't like you much, so we can't do it. I mean, it's a more complex question in the modern world when you've got people of that power.
That's why I responded to that question through the kind of framework of economic development and enterprise development, because we've got well-established means of looking at all of these questions and weighing up what's the right thing to do and how we should go after investment, as opposed to a kind of simplified. And I agree with you, Andy, that the question about whether I should engage with the President of the United States is a completely different question to me, and I've answered that question. But when it comes to economic development measures, we've got to proceed with care and with caution. We can't automatically say, yeah, that's going to be a runner. There's got to be good processes gone through to make sure we're doing the right thing to get the right investment. Because we've got fair work principles that matter to us, that make economic developments conditional because they are so significant to us. So we've got to do these things in the proper fashion. That's essentially why I would answer that question the way that I've answered it.
Shall we talk about energy very quickly, because we do have to let the Deputy First Minister go in a second, but Jeff, go for it.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick and quick questions. I applaud the government for its focus on renewables. I'm living and breathing it every day in the Northeast and in the Highlands. We're spending a lot of time just now. It's really exciting to see, but we're still way off commercialisation. I think we've got to accept that, and it has to be a managed transition. I'm not going to go through all the old arguments, but I just want to ask this one question. Is relying on more fossil fuel imports from overseas bad or good for our environment?
I think fundamentally that is, we'd want to avoid that. So that's why we've got such a focus on making sure that our sustainability is assured by the investments we're making in renewable technology. Now, there will be some requirement for some time for some fossil fuel dependence, but and that's what we're carefully managing to make sure that we navigate our way through these issues in a way that enables us to avoid the situation that you put to me.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear, and this is not, Ronnie and Reggie stats here or Trotter's independent stats. This is the, DESNES, ONS, Q3 stats. Our gas is at a near record low this century in terms of our production, but that's despite our UK reliance on fossil fuels sitting at 71.8%. Our net imports are up to almost 40%. And we know from the regulator and STA that LNG, liquid natural gas, is 4 times more carbon intensive than domestic supply. We're missing an opportunity here, a just transition, and the opportunity for the Scottish government, particularly when we're making the case for independence, is vast. We know that a couple of years ago it was almost 10 billion, and last year it was 4 billion. The fiscal position of Scotland changed dramatically on the back of that from oil and gas revenues. I suppose my point is this: will you get rid of the presumption against oil and gas in your draft energy strategy?
Well, that's it's an issue that's part of the consideration we've got to put into the energy strategy. There's a lot of factors that impact on that, not least of which is the recent Supreme Court case, which we're having to give a lot of detailed consideration to, and which actually, and the reason why we've got to look at it with such care is that case addresses many of the questions that we were addressing within the draft energy strategy, and we cannot, as a government, and you will appreciate this, Jeff, from your experience, we cannot ignore the developments in the law that take place. We have to act in a lawful manner at all times. So that's the consideration that's gone on, as we address the contents of the energy strategy. Amongst other things.
I just need to jump in just because I know you have to go. Would you like to just respond as well?
Yeah, so
as a
I
final
think
point?
so. First Minister's answered that question, but we are at the moment in a tricky place when it comes to the transition, as far as I'm concerned. So we need to get. We've had a bit of momentum over the last couple of years, I think, not least with the big focus on decarbonisation, the transition, investment in renewables, and we're at a tricky point where a lot of the investment that needs to flow to the supply chain to gear up for the huge increase in offshore wind is dependent on offshore wind getting through their processes as well. And what we're trying to do with the big focus of attracting investment is to get as much of the supply chain as possible ready to go. So, for example, the cable factory in Cromarty Firth, but a lot more needs to happen. And the big tension you see, for example, in Leith right now is where you've got a big, massive offshore wind opportunity and a potential factory, and the factory's waiting for the guys to move, and the guys, when they actually get the consenting ready, will need a factory that's ready to go. And our big opportunity is to try and de-risk a lot of that investment and to get it moving so we don't lose momentum.
And I welcome the offshore wind hub, and that will hopefully speed up planning consent, but it's worth bearing out, as much as I appreciate and recognise the ambition that your government has shown, there's not a gram of steel of ScotWind or Intog in the North Sea just now, and right now we're losing jobs. And I'm going to quote you Steve Gray, managing partner of Ventex. He's a climate technology investor. This is the guys that you want in this country. He is taking purely, he's a veteran of the energy industry, and he's moved into renewables and climate technology, AI, robotics, subsea engineering. It is fantastic. Replacing domestic oil and gas production with imports is driving up carbon emissions and dismantling the very supply chain needed to build offshore wind at scale in the coming decades. We cannot save a gram of carbon by importing. Scotland will not be a global leader in energy transition without wholesome support for our oil and gas industry. Only that sector can make the transition domestically driven at scale. You guys have the USP on your doorstep. It is worth a massive value to you economically. Why aren't you supporting it? Why are we having to rely on President-elect Trump to champion the North Sea oil and gas industry and not the Scottish National Party?
I don't think that's a real characterisation of the state of play, Jeff, to be honest.
I'd like to see a Scottish government value its industry, its most valuable industry more.
I think you know full well the dialogue that we have with the oil and gas sector, and I just don't think that's a fair characterisation of what we're trying to manage here, to attract investment, get the building blocks in place to secure the transition to net zero, and to acknowledge and to understand the ongoing role of oil and gas for a period as we manage that transition. And that's lying at the heart of the very delicate balance that we're managing. But I certainly wouldn't accept that characterisation of where we are.
Sure.
No, sorry, Jeff. I just need to say at this point that the Deputy First Minister has to go and speak to members in the south of Scotland.
Yeah.
Is that right? So please
Yeah.
apologise to them on my behalf, our behalf.
I'm
Tell
not
them
sure
as a
it'll take
former,
very much,
very much.
tell them as a
Deputy
former
First
special
Minister.
advisor. It was keeping you back.
Yeah.
Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister, thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
I'm doing a lot at the moment professionally with onshore and offshore and various other renewables, and I think the thing that's becoming clearer and clearer is that as the Scottish economy moves up and out, not just in renewables actually, but whisky, salmon, all these sorts of things, the Scottish economy is probably over the coming decades going to become more rural and less urban because of the scale of opportunity in those industries. But the people are still moving in the other direction. So there seems to me to be a long-term issue over depopulation effectively, and the movement of people away from the areas where the economy is moving towards. And there's also a very significant lack of infrastructure in these areas, housing, roads, broadband, to cope with the scale of the economic opportunity that lies ahead. I just wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, I don't think the renewables revolution is an inevitability unless the building blocks are in place to actually make it all happen. And again, this is not probably for 2026, but as you look in the longer term and your vision in the longer term, how concerned are you about the lack of infrastructure, housing, transport, broadband, in the areas where we need the economy to move towards? Because it seems to me to be a pretty big gap at the moment in terms of where we need to be to make this actually happen?
I think we need to look at this from there's obviously an integrated range of issues in here that have got to be addressed. So you've got to, the question of population underpins these questions. So if you take, for example, what's happening in the Murray and Cromarty Firth areas just now, we've got two very major developments at Ardazir and at Nig. The Sumitomo factory at Nig and the Haventus development at Ardazir. Now these have the potential, and they are now the subject of investment involving Scottish National Investment Bank and various other private interests that are investing. So they are beginning to attract the momentum that they require, but they will also require a population to work within them and to support them. So we have to make sure that that population is available, and what flows from that will also be the accommodation requirements, and they'll be across a whole range of different different sectors and levels of the economy. Now that will have to be carefully managed with local authority partners. The fact that we were able to land these investments in the first place are as a result of very good collaboration involving enterprise agencies and local authority partners and investment resources supported by government. And I think again the provisions in the budget are designed to put in place the support that can enable that to happen. But you're right, Andy, there will be a reshaping of the population base of the country. You've got the Scotland round, which has brought clarity about investment, about project leadership. You have got the increasing, I've just talked about some of the investment opportunities that are now being turned into reality, whether that's about Ardazir or about Nig, which are some of the physical infrastructure that's required to manufacture and manage many of these propositions. I was up myself recently opening the operations and maintenance facilities of Ocean Winds in the Murray East and West developments, which, contrary to what you're saying, you can see them from Buckie. They're out there in
that's not Scotland, though. To be fair.
Well, I know, but I'm
yeah,
talking
sure.
But so the project proposals are there. The proposals have got to come forward for consenting, and we have in place in the Scottish Government the capacity to handle the consenting of these particular projects. They've got to go through proper evaluation, but the consenting arrangements are in place. On the points of feedback from industry, again, the point on is government hearing it all? I've heard very directly from many organisations the importance of the government having effective consenting arrangements. They are now in place. I'm very confident that they exist. You then come into the availability of investment. The Scottish National Investment Bank has a significant patient capital role to play in that respect, and the government, which is part of the budget, is about the tripling of investment in offshore renewable potential. And then you do come to one of the areas that does cause me unease, and that's about grid connection.
Yeah.
And that's not in our control. And this is where
neither, to be fair, is the Contracts for Difference, which is led by Westminster as well, and that's causing some concerns.
There are some concerns there, but fundamentally I think the pinch point that I would be concerned about is about grid. Now, I've made this point to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister knows the importance that we attach. I've made it to the chair of GB Energy as well, that Jürgen Meyer is very much aware of the importance of this issue, because without that, if investors, these are sound propositions, but if investors cannot see a means of taking the product, electricity, to market because of grid connection obstacles, then that will be an impediment to the realisation of this opportunity. So that's why we're pressing so hard for that issue to be given the prominence and the seriousness that it requires, so that we can make the progress that we can make. So I think all these component parts are there. I'm not answering your question saying there's no risk, because the risk, I think, is principally about grid connections, and I hope that's going to be resolved by our interaction with the UK government.
First Minister, you've been extremely generous with your time. Thank you very much indeed. It strikes me actually, we had obviously the Deputy First Minister here as well for what, over an hour. A couple of years ago, that was a kind of unthinkable, wasn't it? The two of you sharing a conversation with us like that.
Why would it be unthinkable?
Oh well, because you weren't supportive of her becoming leader of the party.
Well, I think I've had the great privilege of working with Kate on many issues and many projects, and I'm enjoying very much working with her as Deputy First Minister.
Well, we very much enjoyed having you both here. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.